moving from a sedentary to a physically active societal way of life. This is Up on Our Feet.
Welcome to Up on Our Feet. For centuries, human beings have known that exercise and physical activity make us healthy and fit. Exercise and physical activity are good for the body. More recently, modern science shows us in explicit detail just how exercise and physical activity not only make us healthy and fit, but at the same time, they prevent and even are viewed as treatments for the major chronic diseases of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, hypertension, stroke, and similar diseases. And as we've heard here on previous episodes of Up on Our Feet, within the last 2 decades, we've learned that physical activity and exercise are not only good for the body and our physical health, they are equally impactful on the brain and our mental health. In fact, current and emerging research is demonstrating that physical activity positively impacts cognition, learning, and memory. And just as the more physically active we are, the healthier we are. It is also now known that the more physically active we are, the better our brain works. And this is especially true for school children and their learning. The more physically active they are, the better their academic performance. And for seniors, so we just talked about kids, and for seniors, we've learned in our previous episode with Professor Laura Middleton of the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, that physical activity greatly reduces the risk of developing forms of dementia, especially Alzheimer's, and can slow its progression for those who already have Alzheimer's. In addition, research is now showing that exercise and physical activity can also prevent and act as a treatment for another major mental disorder, depression. And our guest is someone who has studied and conducted extensive research in this area. Dr. Philip Holmes is a professor of the Behavioral and Brain Sciences program in the Department of Psychology in the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Georgia. His recent work focuses on the neurochemical basis for the antidepressant effects of exercise that demonstrate how physical activity impacts depression. Professor Holmes, it's nice to have you with us.
Well, thanks for inviting me on. It's good to see you, Joel.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's start off with a general perspective here. And I don't know if you have this information, but how extensive is depression today, both here in the United States and globally?
Well, before the pandemic, it was identified as one of the major disease burdens, both in the United States and increasingly globally. That's obviously changed a little bit in recent years, but the disease burden really calculates how big an impact disease has on your health and well-being. And so depression continues to be a major burden of disease, and estimates range from 10 to 20% of the US population experiencing depression at some point in their lives.
Okay, and then what are depression's origins? How do people become depressed?
So that's a really great question, and that's something we need to be thinking about more and more, especially when we think about ultimately how exercise may provide a protective effect or treat depression. So typically in popular culture and unfortunately in the medical profession, much of the medical profession, over the years, depression has been explained as primarily in terms of a deficit in the monoamine neurotransmitters. And the monoamine neurotransmitters include transmitters like serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine.
And these are all chemicals in the brain, right?
These are all, yeah, the neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers in the brain, and they're really responsible for the most important aspect of information processing in the brain. So it's really the neurotransmitters that are doing most of the work. And so the old idea is that depression symptoms are merely a matter of a deficit in these monoamine neurotransmitter. In particular, serotonin has received most of the attention. Now, increasingly over the past few decades, and especially most recently, the evidence has converged to indicate that it's not simply a matter of some deficit in serotonin, let's say. In fact, there's never been any evidence that depression symptoms are caused by some sort of deficit in the signaling of serotonin. Increasingly, we've seen the evidence pointing toward what's referred to as the trophic theory of depression. And according to the trophic theory of depression, depression fundamentally is caused by a deficit in what's referred to as synaptic plasticity. So that's just really refers to the changeability of neurons. So really, it's more accurate to think of depression as a disorder of neuroplasticity.
Okay, so just when and how did you first get interested in how exercise and physical activity positively impact depression? How did this happen?
So I've always been interested in stress. So my entire career has focused on stress responses, and in particular, the neurotransmitters that are really important in mediating or regulating stress responses. And so I focused on a neurotransmitter primarily called norepinephrine, which is really important for those functions. I also, part of that system, those neurons that make norepinephrine, they also make a neuropeptide and trophic factor called galanin, which is found in essentially all of the norepinephrine neurons in the brain. So I was studying norepinephrine and galanin and the role of these neurotransmitters in stress. And many, many years ago, a colleague of mine named Rod Dishman here at UGA was interested in the impact of exercise on stress. And so we collaborated and did some experiments looking at the impact of exercise on norepinephrine. And that's where the research started. We really thought we'd be focusing on this neurotransmitter norepinephrine.
Okay, all right, then just how do exercise and forms of physical activity positively impact depression? What's the process for how this happens?
Well, in our early research, as I mentioned, we thought the story would be about norepinephrine, but what we discovered for the first time, and this was many years ago, and we were the first lab to report this, was that exercise caused an upregulation of this trophic factor called galanin. Now, at the same time, many other labs were looking at another trophic factor called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's probably the best studied neurotrophic factor. And so we saw this pattern where exercise generally increased levels of these trophic factors. And I should explain, a trophic factor is another signaling molecule that's really important for the growth, maintenance, and survival of neurons. It's also involved in the proliferation of neurons. So most neurons can't replicate, but there are some exceptions. And so there's this body of research showing that exercise was really good generally at turning up levels of these trophic factors. And that occurred at the level of gene expression. So exercise was somehow turning on these genes for things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor and galanin.
Okay, so the physical activity, the exercise, produces these trophic factors, and then they have an impact on the galanin, and it's the galanin then that in some way affects the chemicals in the brain related to depression.
Yeah, so that was our hypothesis. And so we looked at what galanin does. It functions itself as a trophic factor. And so we, again, coming from the angle of stress, because we're interested not just in depression, but any stress-related disorder. Mm-hmm. So depression is certainly one of those. So we focus more on stress responses, and we started looking at the behavioral level. Does exercise itself decrease generally stress-related behaviors? We also wondered whether exercise can decrease responsivity or vulnerability to stressors. And then at the neural level, the hypothesis was maybe the beneficial impact of exercise on stress responses has to do with this trophic effect. In other words, it may have to do with a rewiring of the brain or a protection of circuits in the brain that are important for stress resilience. And so that was the original hypothesis, and that's what led to our discovery that exercise, in fact, does promote resilience to stress, and it does so by maintaining these circuits in the brain that are critical for stress resilience.
Okay, so is this a way, then you talked about this impacting the genetic makeup. Is this a way of evolution and our genetic makeup, who we are as human beings? Is this a way, a message, if you will, that we need to be physically active and not sedentary? And not only, as we said in the introduction, it makes us healthy and fit, and the learning and memory improves in the brain. But it seems like you're also saying here, it's also a way of evolution of telling us we need to be physically active and not sedentary. And when we are, we're less likely to be stressed, we're less likely to be depressed, we're more likely to be whatever, happy or okay, and not depressed. Is that what this is about?
Yeah, and so more fundamentally, neuroplasticity, just the changeability and the rewiring of neurons, is a normal brain function. So the brain should always be doing this. So it's a very dynamic thing. It's not just a matter of that you have these circuits and they fire these electrical impulses and they release neurotransmitters and the system is set and it just keeps on working once it's laid down. In fact, these connections throughout the brain are constantly being reformed and hopefully maintained. The right circuitry needs to be maintained. So the function of these trophic factors should be going on all the time. It's a normal brain function. And so presumably that function is maintained in part by environmental enrichment and exercise, which really, when you think about it, and from my perspective, exercise is a very robust form of environmental enrichment because you're basically just increasing all of the sensory input into the brain. The brain is processing this and matching the motor input to match the sensory input. And so that's a normal function of the brain. So this should be happening normally all the time. We should be actively involved in our environment. If we're doing that through, say, exercise, then we should have a normal level or tone of these trophic factors. If we're not doing that, say through a sedentary lifestyle, then we would expect to see, and what we have found in my lab is that the expression of these trophic factor genes actually goes down. And so if those trophic factors go down in the brain, then we're going to lose those important connections that are responsible not only, as you mentioned in your introduction, for normal cognitive function, but also for normal emotional function, and in particular, emotion regulation.
Okay. All right. So then let's look at what you're talking about now regarding physical activity impacting the brain and its relationship to depression. How does physical activity then compare to other forms of treatment for depression, especially prescriptive drugs and psychotherapy, because those are more in a passive way than the physical activity?
Right, and so this has been well studied. We do know that a really good structured exercise program is as effective as pharmacotherapy. And we've known for a long time that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really the most effective form of psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy is also roughly as effective as pharmacotherapy. So if we look at those, let's start with those three forms of therapy. We've got the pharmacotherapy, exercise, and cognitive behavioral therapy. So I mentioned that exercise turns up trophic factors. It turns out that with pharmacotherapy, antidepressant drugs, chronic treatment, not acute treatment, and that's a really important distinction. With
And
chronic
chronic means
several
ongoing.
weeks.
Acute is just a one-shot deal, right?
Several weeks, right. And you need to be taking it for several weeks. That's very important. So with chronic treatment, several weeks, but not acute treatment, with the standard antidepressant drugs of all classes, they also cause an upregulation or increase in trophic factors. Okay. Now, with cognitive behavioral therapy, it's harder to get the neurobiological mechanism underlying cognitive behavioral therapy because we can't move that into rats, right? We can't do cognitive behavioral therapy in rats. But what we do know from the basic science literature is that, first of all, cognitive behavioral therapy is learning. What you're doing in cognitive behavioral therapy is learning how to interpret and regulate your emotions and learn about, for example, controllability over stress. We've known from a very long literature over many years that learning, the fundamental mechanisms of learning involve trophic factors and neuroplasticity. So here we have these three therapies that all impact trophic factors. So anything that's therapeutic for depression works through trophic factors. And interestingly, we can expand that list. So electroconvulsive therapy, we also know, because we can study that in rats, it's very potent in increasing trophic factors in the brain. And electroconvulsive therapy is effective in treating depression, especially in severe acute cases. Increasingly, people are looking more and more at transcranial magnetic stimulation, which you can think of as sort of a low-level stimulation that is a lower intensity electroconvulsive therapy. We know that that also increases trophic factors and it increases neuroplasticity. So basically, anything that's effective in treating depression works through that common mechanism of promoting neuroplasticity. And that's really increasingly the best evidence for the trophic theory. Now, just to make it more interesting, there's actually recent evidence that antidepressants themselves with chronic administration may directly interact with the receptors for trophic factors and work through a very direct mechanism. But we're still talking with the same basic mechanism for effective therapies in depression, and that is increasing trophic factors and plasticity.
Okay, so looking at all three of these, we've got physical activity, what do you call it?
Pharmacotherapy, drug treatment.
Pharmacotherapy, psychotherapy.
Yep.
With all your work that you've done, do you have a preference as to which one of the three would be preferable that you would recommend to people, or are there advantages and disadvantages to all three?
Well, from a practical medical perspective, and I'm not a clinician, but really, I think the consensus is in the medical profession is try them all, right? So you might start your patient on pharmacotherapy. If you can add cognitive behavioral therapy, that would be great. Now that's a challenge, right? Because it takes more time. There is more of a commitment. It's harder to schedule. It may not be covered by insurance, but optimally, in the optimal situation, you could recommend cognitive behavioral therapy. And also, you can certainly recommend exercise. Now, an issue clinically there is just going to be compliance. And that's, as you know, that's a very big, broad issue in the field of exercise research anyway. But in a patient with depression, that's going to be a particular challenge. The good news on that front, though, is that we found in our lab that it doesn't take a whole lot of exercise to increase the expression of trophic factors. So we've actually found a dose-dependent or dose-response relationship between the amount of exercise, and the level of increase in trophic factors. So that what that tells us is that even a little bit of exercise is good because it will increase trophic factors. So that will be beneficial. So if a clinician can tell her patient to, you don't have to go out and exercise, but if you can, walk around the block, that's a starting point. And I should mention that in our research, we've used a voluntary exercise paradigm. So different labs will use different paradigms. So in some labs, it's more of a forced exercise paradigm that usually involves putting rats on a treadmill where they have to run on the treadmill to keep up. And that certainly works in increasing trophic factors. In our lab, we use voluntary exercise, and that's really just a matter of putting a running wheel, an activity wheel, in the rat's cage and comparing that condition to rats that don't have a running wheel. And the great thing about that is the rats with the running wheel will run 5, sometimes 10K a night. So they are running a lot, and it's all voluntary. Another interesting aspect of that is, and research done by my colleagues in exercise science and kinesiology, have shown that with the running wheel activity, the voluntary activity, you don't really see the physiological changes that we typically associate with fitness, with physical fitness, things like VO2 max or muscle physiology. So that tells me that the exercise does not need to be very intense. It's not as if we need to go into training to get these benefits. We can get these benefits with relatively low levels of activity. But again, it's a dose-dependent relationship. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think all of the above, but it's also going to depend on the individual situation and preferences of the patient.
Okay. So what you're saying, from what I hear you saying, is regarding the physical activity, you don't have to be a marathon runner or anything like that. You can just go out and do regular brisk walking in order to get the kind of benefits, trophic factor benefits regarding depression. Yes?
Right. Yes, and that's correct. Now, we also need to be thinking about the time course of this, right? And so it's not like you can go out, even if you go out and run a marathon, that's probably not going to be therapeutic. It's not like you can suddenly turn on all your trophic factor genes and you're done. Just like the pharmacotherapy, this takes time. And so some labs have looked at how long it takes. It's difficult to do that research because the exercise actually kind of ramps up in the rats. But the indications are that like the cognitive behavioral therapy and pharmacotherapy, we're really talking about weeks in order for these genes to be turned on. So that's where a structured, regular program is really important. It's related to the issue of what's happening in pharmacotherapy. So I remind my students in my classes all the time that antidepressant drugs are not happy pills. That is not how they work. It's not like you're feeling down and you pop an antidepressant and that makes you feel better. It doesn't work that way at all. Same thing with exercise. It's, you might feel better after a bout of exercise. I generally do, and that's all good. But in terms of treating depression, you really need to be thinking about the more long-term changes that are happening over a course of days to weeks, how it's changing the patterns of gene expression, and then maintaining those levels of gene expression to maintain these protective effects of the trophic factors. And so that's really the way to think about it.
Regarding these three forms, the prescriptive drugs have the advantage that you can just take a pill, but you've got possible side effects and you also have the costs.
Yep.
And with psychotherapy, you have the time element, the costs, that whole thing.
Right.
With physical activity, isn't this a lifestyle issue. As I said, in the intro, we talked to Professor Laura Middleton at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, about how physical activity greatly reduces the risk of dementia. But she said the magic question is, how do you get people, as you just mentioned, to incorporate physical activity, not only in an acute way over a week or two or something like that, but from what I hear you saying, this has to be an ongoing process in their life where they make a lifestyle change. But people, the pill is much easier. How do you, or do you even know, how do you get people then to make this lifestyle change? Because not only would it impact their depression, just all the other physical and mental benefits that go with it would be a part of this.
Yeah, and that's really the big challenge, right, for the whole field, is figuring out what is the best strategy to change behavior and attitudes about exercise. And I'm a basic neuroscientist, so I don't have any good answers to that. But I do think just the knowledge itself is helpful. So if people know that exercise can literally change the way the brain works, and it does so by protecting these critical circuits in the brain that are essential for normal positive mood. Just that information alone, I think, is helpful. And the understanding that it's not just going out and feeling a lift in your mood after you run, because if that's all there is to it, then that's not going to last very long, and you might feel bad again in a few hours afterwards. But just understanding that change in the lifestyle and just being more active. So all the basic things that we're told about increasing physical activity in general, using the stairs, for example, walking when you can to the store or the market or the post office. These kinds of little things, from my research, it shows that they can add up and have a significant benefit, because that's the way the brain wants to work. The brain evolved to expect a relatively high level of activity. The brain didn't evolve for us to be sitting at our desks staring at a screen, right? It evolved to be interacting with the environment. So anything we can do to increase that is going to be beneficial.
Okay, so in a way, are you saying that the brain rewards us for being physically active by thinking more clearly, remembering more, being happier, less depressed? Is that it?
Yep, it's the way to optimize brain function is through environmental enrichment, which includes exercise. And I think another thing that's important for people to realize is that that's another great aspect of exercise, is that it is environmental enrichment. So if you're just taking a jog around your neighborhood, your brain is doing a lot of work to make that happen. We're not aware of it because a lot of that activity is happening below our level of awareness, below our neocortex. But the other parts of the brain are very, very active. So the structure I study, in particular, the locus coeruleus, which is where these norepinephrine neurons are, they're very active during exercise, and they're critical for making sure we're processing the information properly in order to perform the exercise, like running around the block. And so not only are you exercising the rest of your body, but you are literally exercising these critical circuits in the brain when you perform these relatively simple tasks. Again, it doesn't have to be a marathon. Even walking around the block is activating these brain circuits. And that's how the brain evolved, is to deal with these in behavioral environment interactions.
Okay, in this context, I'm glad you brought this up. I first became aware of you you were quoted in a Time magazine article in June 2010 about exercise and its impact on depression. And in that article, you had a quote. And what I'd like to do is read the quote back to you so our viewers can hear it, and then have you respond and say, what's your thinking behind this quote? Because this just jumped out at me. And the quote is this: "It occurs to us being, I assume, fellow neuroscientists, it occurs to us that exercise is the more normal or natural condition, and that being sedentary is really the abnormal situation." What's behind your thinking on this?
Right. And so that struck us immediately when we just looked at the activity wheel running. So as I mentioned, I was sort of new to the exercise field. And so when I started doing these experiments of just putting the running wheel in the cage, the first thing that struck me was how much the rats ran per night. As I mentioned, 5K was pretty normal, and some would run a 10K a night. And so that struck me as, wow, and that's voluntary. They don't have to do that. They just do that. And so that led me to think, well, that's got to be what rats normally do, right? And if you think about it, well, yeah, if they're out in the environment, they probably have to cover a lot of territory to find food. And so they're doing that normally. And so that really informs how all mammals or vertebrates, or at least most of them, are interacting with their environment. So that we should think of that as the normal situation, being highly active. And whereas the abnormal situation or unnatural situation would be, in our rat studies, the sedentary condition, where the rats didn't have that opportunity to run. And so in many ways, that was really the experimental condition, right? So the activity wheel condition was more naturalistic and normal, but it's a sedentary condition that is non-naturalistic. And you think about the human condition now, just a few generations ago, people were much more active than they are now. So I think we're doing a big experiment, social experiment, where we're looking at the impact of sedentary lifestyles over the last few generations on health in general, but mental health as well. So it's interesting to think about that, but it really does fit this perspective of how these systems evolved, including the brain systems.
Okay. Final question. Throughout all your years of work, with all the studies you've conducted, the papers you've authored and co-authored, from a big picture perspective, what's the big message, the big takeaway, the major conclusion you've come to from all your work?
I would say, first of all, just the importance of trophic factors in general, and also the fact that there are many, many different trophic factors that are all working together. So it's important to realize that even though a lot of research is focused on brain-derived neurotrophic factor, we need to be looking at these other neurotrophic factors like galanin and how they play a role, because they often get overlooked. So as a trophic factor, galanin could be important not only for depression and stress resilience, but also for things like neurodegenerative disorders, because trophic factors are going to be the counter to neural degeneration, right? If we can turn up trophic factors in the brain through things like exercise, that should slow down the neurodegeneration associated, or even possibly prevent, if we catch it early on, the degeneration associated with things like Alzheimer's disease. So that's one of the big important take-homes for me. And also in the context of exercise is just the importance of physical activity in maintaining normal brain function.
Okay. Professor Philip Holmes of the University of Georgia, thanks for being with us on Up on Our Feet.
Thank you for inviting me. It was great chatting with you, Joel.